The phone call lasted 43 seconds. That was how long it took for everything Nora had spent 6 years building to come apart. She was standing in the parking garage beneath the Harwick Group's head office on Bay Street, still wearing her good blazer, the one she'd ironed the night before, because she knew Tuesday was when the partners reviewed the quarterly accounts. She had her bag over one shoulder and her lunch container in the other hand, leftover rice and beans she hadn't touched, and the voice on the other end of the line belonged to Gerald Fitch, the senior compliance officer, who told her in the tone of a man reading off a grocery list that her access had been revoked, her desk had been cleared, and she should not attempt to return to the 32nd floor. "There are discrepancies," he said. "In accounts you managed." She almost laughed. Almost. "What discrepancies?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics, Nora. Don't call me that." She hadn't meant to say it. Her name from his mouth felt like a trick. He'd always called her by her first name, always made it sound like a small joke, only he understood. "What discrepancies, Mr. Fitch?" He hung up. She stood there in the concrete dark for a long time. A car passed, then another. Someone's headlights swept across the pillar beside her and kept going. She looked down at the lunch container in her hand. The lid had cracked somewhere along the way. She didn't remember dropping it. Her name was Nora Whitfield. No, wait. Her name was Sylvie Marsh. She'd been telling herself her whole life to keep the facts straight, to not let things blur at the edges, to hold the numbers exactly as they were, no rounding, no approximating. That was what she was good at. Better than good. She had been the best accounts analyst at the Harwick Group for 3 years running, and before that she'd been the best at the 2 firms that came before, and before that she'd worked double shifts at a depot outside Sudbury to pay for a night course in financial accounting, because her mother had needed the daytime hours to work, and there was no one else to watch her younger brothers. She was 31 years old. She had $4,200 in a savings account she hadn't touched in 8 months. She had a studio apartment in the West End, a transit pass, and a reputation for finding errors that other people missed. Someone had used that reputation against her. She already knew who. She just had no way to prove it. The man's name was Doyle Parrish. He was 47, a senior partner, and he had been quietly moving money through a shell account that ran adjacent to one of her files for the better part of a year. She'd found the first trace of it 6 weeks ago, a transposition that was too precise to be accidental, a pattern of small withdrawals timed to overlap with legitimate transfers. She'd documented it. She'd been careful. She'd told no one because she hadn't been sure yet, and in accounting, you didn't say a thing until you were sure. Doyle Parrish had apparently been watching her document it. She didn't go home. She walked. It was October in Toronto, and the wind off the lake had an edge to it that people who'd grown up here barely noticed anymore. But Sylvie had grown up in a mining town, and she still felt it, the way cold could come from a direction you weren't expecting. She walked west along King Street with her ruined lunch container still in her hand until she realized she was still holding it, and she dropped it in a bin outside a coffee shop and went inside and ordered nothing and sat at a corner table and thought. She was methodical about it. That was the only way she knew how to be. She had the documentation. 14 pages of it, backed up in 3 places, including a personal drive her work laptop had never touched. She had dates. She had amounts. She had a pattern of transfers that, if you knew what you were looking at, told a story clear as an invoice. What she didn't have was anyone willing to listen to her tell it, because right now she was the former employee with discrepancies in her accounts, and Doyle Parrish was a senior partner with 30 years of handshakes behind him. She needed leverage, or she needed someone with more standing than a ruined reputation. What she got, 3 days later, was a white envelope left under her apartment door. No postage, no return address. Her name on the front, spelled correctly, in the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who had learned it deliberately and never let it go casual. She stood in the hallway in her socks and looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. Inside was a single card. No letterhead, no logo, just a name, Voss, and an address in the distillery district, and a time, Thursday, 7 p.m. below that in the same precise hand. We have a mutual problem. She should have thrown it away. She knew that. She'd grown up near enough to the edges of things to know that anonymous invitations from people with single names were not the beginning of anything good. She'd spent her whole adult life getting far enough away from that particular lesson that she didn't have to think about it anymore. She went anyway. The address was a building that looked like a converted warehouse from the outside, and felt, from the inside, like someone had decided to make a point about what money could do to brick and reclaimed wood. A man at the door, large, quiet, with the specific kind of stillness that meant he was paying attention to everything, looked at her name against a list he kept in his head rather than on paper, and stepped aside without a word. She was shown to a room on the second floor. Dark table, 2 chairs, a glass of water that she suspected had been placed there for her. She didn't touch it. She waited 8 minutes. She counted. The man who came through the door was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said, afterward, exactly what she had expected. He was tall and moved like someone who had learned very early that the amount of space you occupied in a room was a choice you made consciously. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had not come off any rack, and he had the kind of face that had been through enough to settle into something harder than age alone could account for. There was a scar along his left jaw, pale and old. His eyes, when they found her, were the particular grey of overcast mornings in November. He sat down across from her. He didn't offer his hand. "Marsh," he said. "Not a question. You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "You know my name. I only have yours. Voss." He said it the same way it was written, like it was sufficient. "Is that a first name or a last name?" "It's the name I use." She looked at him. He looked at her. She'd sat across from enough people in enough negotiations to know when someone was calibrating her, measuring the distance between what she said and what she meant. She let him. "You said we have a mutual problem," she said. "Doyle Parrish," he said. "He's been using shell accounts to skim from capital flows. He's been doing it for approximately 18 months. For the first 14 of those months, the accounts he was skimming from had nothing to do with mine. 2 months ago, he moved one of the flows into a stream I have a financial interest in. I became aware of it." He paused. "I also became aware that someone at the Harwick Group had already noticed, and had documented it with considerable precision. You read my files." "I had someone read them." Yes, she should have been furious. She was, actually, in a cold and distant way that she set aside for later. "How? That's not particularly relevant to why you're here. It's relevant to whether I trust anything you say." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like the registration of a data point he hadn't accounted for. "Fair," he said. "I'll tell you what I can when it becomes useful. What I need from you now is access to those files in a format that will hold up. And I need your testimony, if it comes to that, from someone who can speak to the methodology without it being dismissed. And what do I get?" Parrish loses his position, his license, and any ability to damage your career further. The discrepancies attached to your name disappear. You walk away clean. "That's the floor," she said. "What's the ceiling?" He was quiet for a moment. She thought absurdly of the way certain columns balanced on paper, the satisfaction of a number that landed exactly where it was supposed to. "A job," he said. "Temporary. 6 months. You manage the accounts of an organization that requires someone who is precise, discreet, and evidently not easily intimidated." "What kind of organization?" He held her gaze. "The kind that pays very well and asks very little about your background." She understood what he wasn't saying. She'd known, from the envelope, from the building, from the specific quality of the stillness of the man at the door, that the person she was meeting was not a lawyer or a private equity contact, or any of the things a reasonable person might have hoped. She'd come anyway, and she'd known why, and now it was being named without being named, and she had to decide. She thought about her $4,200. She thought about Doyle Parrish sitting in his corner office right now, probably having a drink, probably very relaxed. She thought about 6 years of work that had been turned into a liability overnight by a man who had simply decided she was useful to destroy. 6 months, she said. 6 months, and then I'm out. Clean. No continued obligation. If you want to be out, he said, you'll be out. She noticed the phrasing. She filed it. I'll need a week to transfer the documentation in a way that can't be traced back to my personal drive. You have 3 days. I need a week. Another pause. Longer this time. Fine. She stood up. He watched her. You came here, he said, knowing what I probably was. Yes. Why? She picked up her bag. Because Doyle Parish has 30 years of clean hands and a lot of friends. I have the truth and no one to give it to. I'm practical. She left without touching the water. The organization was called Nothing, officially. It had a holding company name that meant as little as a grocery receipt and a legitimate-seeming accounting firm as its public face. Sylvie's first week was spent in a glass-walled office on a floor that had no signage, going through 4 years of ledgers that had been maintained with care, but not with the particular kind of care that came from someone who thought about the story a number told when you read it sideways. She found 3 things in the first week that she flagged. Voss reviewed her notes on the 3rd day and said nothing for a long time. These were missed by our previous accountant, he said finally. Were they missed or ignored? He looked up. Does it matter? It matters to whether you have a problem in your organization or a problem with a specific person. He considered that. The previous accountant left 6 months ago under circumstances I chose not to examine closely. You might want to examine them now. He did, apparently, because by the end of the week there was a conversation she was not present for, and an outcome she was not informed of, but could extrapolate, from the way the air in the office changed when she came in on Monday. Some problems, she had learned, resolved in different ways depending on who was doing the resolving. She didn't ask. She was practical. What she hadn't expected was to find the work genuinely interesting. She'd spent 6 years in firms where the goal was to make the numbers look correct. This was different. The accounts she managed here were real in the way that a live wire was real. There were actual flows of actual money going to actual places for actual purposes, and the purposes were not always the kind she would have chosen, but the mathematics of it was honest in its way. There was no dressing it up. There was no quarterly report with projections softened for optics. The ledger said what it said. She respected that in a bleak kind of way. She also found herself, against every reasonable instinct, noticing Voss. Not in the way she would have wanted to notice someone. Not the way she'd noticed the last person she'd let herself care about, which had ended badly enough that she'd stopped letting herself for a while. This was different. She noticed him the way she noticed a column that didn't quite add up yet. Persistent, involuntary, a thing that kept returning when she was trying to concentrate on something else. He was in the office most mornings when she arrived. He left late. He drank his coffee black and ate almost nothing at his desk, and worked with the focused silence of someone who had decided long ago that distractions were expensive. He spoke to her when there was a reason to speak to her. He never made it personal. He never asked about her life outside the office or offered any information about his own. The scar along his jaw was from a knife. She didn't know how she knew that. She just did. He called her Marsh. Only ever Marsh. She called him Voss because that was the only option available, and somehow they had arrived at a working dynamic that felt, in its own strange way, like a form of respect. She had the run of the accounts. He reviewed her work but never questioned her methodology. When she flagged something, he acted on it without asking her to justify herself. When she made a recommendation, he considered it seriously. No one had ever taken her recommendation seriously on the first pass. Not in 6 years. The parish situation resolved in the 3rd week. She didn't hear about it through official channels because there were no official channels involved. What she knew was that on a Tuesday morning, while she was reconciling a set of receivables, her phone rang, and it was a number she didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end was the senior partner at a different firm. A firm she had applied to twice in the past 3 years and been quietly passed over, asking if she was available for a conversation. She was, she said. She'd be in touch. She hung up and sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to the receivables. When Voss came in that afternoon, she was in the middle of a discrepancy she was almost finished untangling, and she didn't look up. "Parrish resigned this morning," he said. "The firm is reviewing the accounts. The discrepancies attached to your name have been attributed to his conduct. You'll likely receive a formal statement from the firm's legal team by end of week." She kept her eyes on the ledger for another 3 seconds to finish the thought. Then she looked up. "Thank you," she said. "It was in my interest." "I know. It's still worth saying." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to associate with him, registering something he hadn't fully anticipated. Then he nodded once, very slightly, and went to his own desk. She'd been there for 3 weeks. She had 15 weeks and 4 days left. She started counting differently after that. It wasn't something she planned. She wasn't impulsive. She'd worked hard at not being impulsive, at replacing every instinct she'd grown up with in Sudbury with something more deliberate and measured, because the people she'd grown up around who listened to their instincts mostly ended up back where they started. But she began to notice, with the same precision she brought to everything else, a series of small data points. Voss remembered her coffee order after she mentioned it once. He never said anything about it. A cup simply appeared on her desk on the mornings he arrived before she did, and she drank it without acknowledging it because that seemed to be the agreement they'd silently arrived at. He also, she noticed, had read something she'd mentioned in passing about a paper on forensic accounting she'd written for a course 5 years ago, and she knew because he referenced a specific methodology from it in a way that was too specific to be accidental. He'd found it. He'd read it. She found that difficult to account for in her usual way. There was also the evening in the 5th week when she was still at her desk at 8:30, working through a particularly stubborn set of year-end accounts, and he appeared in the doorway with his coat already on and looked at her for a moment. "When did you last eat?" he said. "I had something at lunch. That was 9 hours ago." She looked up at him. He had the expression of a man who had noticed a problem and was working out the most efficient way to address it. Not concern, exactly, or maybe concern stripped of all its softness, concern as a logistical matter. "I'm almost finished," she said. "Bring it with you. There's a place 2 blocks from here that's still open and doesn't have terrible food." She should have said no. The line between professional and everything else was the only line that had ever actually protected her, and she'd been careful about it her whole life. But it was 8:30, and she was hungry, and she was tired, and the number she was looking for was probably not going to appear tonight anyway. She brought her coat. They sat across from each other in a small restaurant with paper on the tables and a specials board written in chalk, and ate soup and bread and did not talk about the accounts. She hadn't had a conversation that had nothing to do with work or logistics in a while. She hadn't noticed how long until she was in the middle of one and felt something in her shoulders loosen. He talked about Toronto in the way of someone who had moved here from somewhere else and decided it was worth the trouble. She talked about Sudbury without meaning to, about the particular quality of winter there, about growing up in a house where money was understood as a kind of physics. It followed laws you couldn't argue with. It moved in one direction, and you were either above it or below it. She didn't usually tell people that. She hadn't meant to tell him. He didn't react to it the way people usually did, with the careful sympathy that felt like being handed something you didn't ask for. He just listened, and then he said, "My grandfather ran numbers for a crew in Montreal, kept every transaction in his head, never wrote it down. He always said the safest place to keep a record was somewhere no one else could reach." She looked at him. "Is that why you hired me?" "Because I keep my record somewhere no one else can reach." His mouth did something that was almost a smile. Among other reasons, she didn't ask what the other reasons were. She wasn't ready for the answer. Walking back to the office to get her things, she became aware that at some point between the restaurant and the street, the distance between them had shifted. Not dramatically, just by the width of one decision, quiet and unacknowledged, that had happened without her choosing it consciously. His hand, briefly, at the small of her back as they stepped around a group coming out of a bar. her breath doing something inconvenient, neither of them saying anything. In the elevator up to the office, she kept her eyes on the numbers ticking up. He kept his on the door. They rode up in silence, and the silence was a different kind than the one they'd established in the first 3 weeks. She got her bag. She said goodnight. She went home and lay awake for an hour. This was inadvisable, she told herself. She knew what kind of man he was, not in the sense that people used that phrase to mean character. She'd watched him be fair and honest in his way, and more careful about keeping his word than most people she'd worked for in legitimate firms. She meant it in the practical sense. He lived in a world with specific rules, and those rules made proximity expensive. She'd signed on for 6 months, not a life, and she'd been clear about that because she'd needed to be clear about it, and he'd agreed. She thought about the paper he'd looked up, the cup of coffee, 5 mornings in a row, the specific way he'd said among other reasons and not finished the sentence. She didn't sleep well. The trouble with being methodical was that you couldn't stop applying it to things you'd rather leave unexamined. She examined, in the weeks that followed, every interaction with the same precision she brought to the accounts, and what she found was a pattern that was consistent and cumulative, and pointed in one direction regardless of how she tried to recalculate it. He trusted her. That was the beginning of it, not the way an employer trusted a useful employee. She'd had enough of those to know what that felt like. He trusted her judgment the way you trusted someone, whose mind worked in a way that made sense to you, and it was mutual, which was the part she found most difficult to manage. She trusted his judgment, too. She trusted it in situations where she would normally trust only herself. 6 weeks in, she found an anomaly in an account linked to a man named Salt, a contact in Vancouver who had interests in logistics and was apparently not as clean in his bookkeeping as he claimed. She brought it to Voss, and he went very still in the way he did when information mattered. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain." He was on the phone within the hour. She heard the call from the next room. Not the words, just the tone, which was the tone of a man who had decided that something required addressing and was now addressing it. Later, she heard that the situation in Vancouver had been resolved. She didn't ask how. She was practical. She had always been practical. What she was having more difficulty being practical about was the morning in week 8 when she came in early and found him already there, standing at the window that faced south toward the lake, not working, just standing. She'd never seen him simply standing before. She stopped in the doorway. He turned when he heard her. "You're early," he said. "So are you." She set her bag down. "Are you all right?" It was a stupid thing to ask. She knew it as she said it. He was not the kind of person who answered that question. But he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I've been doing this for 17 years. There are mornings when the accounting of it doesn't come out the way I need it to." She understood he wasn't talking about numbers. She crossed the room and stood beside him, and they both looked out at the lake, which was flat and silver in the early light. And she said nothing, because sometimes the most useful thing a person could offer was the fact of their presence without requiring anything from it. After a while he said, "You're very good at that." At what? Knowing when to be quiet. She almost told him it had taken her years to learn it. She almost said a lot of things. Instead, she went to her desk and opened the ledger and started where she'd left off the night before, and he went to his desk and did the same, and the morning moved forward the way mornings did. But she caught him looking at her twice before noon. 10 weeks. Then 11. 12. The end of 6 months arrived in the way that endings did when you'd been paying attention to them. Not suddenly, but with an accumulating weight, each remaining day heavier than the last. She had her documentation in order. She had made the accounts as clean and precise as she could make them. She had done what she'd agreed to do. She had also, somewhere in the middle of it, done something she hadn't agreed to, which was to become indispensable in a way that had nothing to do with accounting. She knew it. She thought he knew it. On the last Friday, she stayed late, not because she needed to, because she wasn't ready to leave without saying something that she hadn't worked out how to say yet, and she was running out of time to work it out. He was still there when 8 o'clock came. He was always still there. She closed the last ledger and put it on the stack and said, "I've drafted a handover document. Whoever takes the accounts from here will have everything they need." He looked up. He had a pen in his hand. He set it down. "I've been thinking," he said, "that it may be difficult to find someone with your particular combination of skills. That's a very impersonal way to start this conversation." Something crossed his face. "Yes, it is." A pause. "I'm better at ledgers than this." "So am I," she said. They looked at each other across the space of the office. Two people who had spent 6 months being precise about everything, except the one thing that was sitting between them, large and undeniable, and not going anywhere. "The 6 months," she said, "was an agreement about employment. Yes, it was not an agreement about anything else." "No," he said, "it was not." She stood up. She rounded the desk. She crossed the room and stopped in front of him, close enough that she could see the old scar along his jaw and the new tiredness around his eyes that never fully went away, and she said, "I'm not good at this either, just so that's on the record." "Noted," he said, "and I'm still practical. I'm not. I know what this is. I know who you are. I don't have any illusions about what that means." "I know you don't," he said. "You've never had any illusions about anything. That's one of the reasons." He stopped. "Other reasons," she said quietly. "Yes." She could feel the weight of the city outside the window, all that ordinary life moving along in the dark, and the strange particular silence of this floor, this room, the two of them in it. She had $4,200 in an account she hadn't touched. She had a reputation that was clean again, and a contact at a legitimate firm who was still waiting for her call. She had every reason to walk out of this office tonight and start the next part of her life with her ledger balanced and no outstanding debts. She had never been good at walking away from an account that still had items open. "The handover document covers 3 months," she said. "After that, whoever you bring in is on their own. I'll need full discretion, same as before, and I want the terms renegotiated." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Renegotiated how?" he said. "I'll send you a proposal," she said. His mouth did the thing again, the thing that was almost a smile, and in this light looked close enough to the real version that she felt it in her sternum. "Marsh," he said. "Voss," she said. Outside, the city went on doing what cities did. Inside, two people who kept their records somewhere no one else could reach stood in the space between one agreement ending and another one beginning, and neither of them moved away.